Welcome to Law Matters, where we hear directly from law enforcement on issues that should concern all of us. Listening to these dedicated professionals makes us better informed citizens, resulting in safer communities. Remember, the only people who want to dismantle these agencies are the criminals. So join us because law matters. Our guest today is Mike Vigil, the former Chief of International Operations for the Drug Enforcement Administration. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Sherry. It's a pleasure to be on in your program. I'm always honored to be on your programs.
Well, thank you for being here, too. There's so much to talk about today. I want to start with El Chapo's son. I know he's in protective custody, and when they said they were putting him in protective custody, I'm going, how does that work? He is so recognizable. Can you give us some insight on what's going on with that particular cartel and their leaders and what's going on with Chapo's son?
Yes, every U.S. prison at the federal level, Sherry, has protective custody, and they call it, security housing units, or secure housing units, or SHUs, as they call them, and they put people in there that are in potential danger. They don't have to be cooperating witnesses, but individuals that have come under threat by other inmates. So they are basically segregated from the general population to prevent them from being injured or killed. Now, Chapo Guzman's son, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, who is well known for kidnapping, and Mayo Zambada, who was the head of the Sinaloa cartel. And Mayo Zambada was actually the equivalent of Carlo Gambino from traditional organized crime, because Mayo Zambada now is 76 years old.
Wow.
By his own declaration, he started in the drug trade when he was 16 years old. Now, that's incredible because he, in essence, is saying that he's been in the drug trade for 60 years. And for 60 years, he never saw the inside of a jail cell until he was kidnapped by his godson, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, who is Chapo Guzman's son. He was apparently abducted in Sinaloa and then flown on a private aircraft, not to El Paso, Texas, like most people indicate, but he was flown to a small airport in southern New Mexico. It's a little village called Santa Teresa, where he was taken in, both of them actually were taken into custody. So Mayo Zambada was arraigned in El Paso, Texas, and there was some issues there as to what jurisdiction would try Zambada initially. And New York wanted him, and when you have multiple jurisdictions at the federal level that have accused, let's say, for example, in this case, a drug trafficker, then usually the U.S. Department of Justice will decide what jurisdiction will try him first. And I stated that it would be better if Mayo were tried in New York. Why? Because New York has some of the better U.S. attorneys and assistant U.S. attorneys in the United States, because they have tried some of the most complex conspiracies in the United States. I'm talking about John Gotti, Chapo Guzman, and several others. So if they opted to send him to New York, Mayo Zambada did not fight. How about them sending him to New York? So Wednesday they had a hearing to discuss potential conflict of interest, because his attorney, Frank Perez, is also representing his son, Vicente Zambada. The judge wanted to hear from both sides, from the defense and also the prosecution. And Mike Zambada stated that he wanted Frank Perez. He was not interested in the fact that there might be a conflict of interest because the federal prosecutors in New York have indicated that his son, Vicente, may be a potential witness in this criminal trial. But I think that they can mitigate that by having an independent attorney give advice, in this case to Mayo Zambada, in terms of any potential conflict of interest. In fact, if his son testifies against him, they can have another counsel cross-examine him. So this is going on with Mayo Zambada. But when Mayo Zambada was captured on July 25th of this year, there was speculation of a conflict because normally in Mexico, when they capture or kill a cartel leader, the cartels will fragment. There'll be conflict. There'll be individuals who will vie for control of that criminal organization. And it's kind of interesting because nothing happened until September 9th. And then September 9th, all hell broke loose, and you had competing factions within the Sinaloa cartel, the Chapitos, two other sons of Chapo Guzman, Ivan Archivado, and then also Jesus Alfredo. On the Mayo side, you had his son, Ismael Zambada Sicarios, they call him at Tlaquito Maya, and that has to tremendous violence. And in Sinaloa, Sherry, the violence has become just absolutely rampant. And there's been at least, over 600 murders since September 9th to today's date. And there's been even more individuals who have disappeared in the state of Sinaloa, presumably killed. There's been beheadings, there's been dismemberments. People are afraid of leaving their houses. And it's estimated that at least $1 million worth of commerce has been lost in the state of Sinaloa because over 1,000 businesses have had to close down. I'm talking about, chain stores, clothing stores, even street vendors have to close down because of the violence. People are not leaving their homes. Children are not attending school. And the Mexican government has sent thousands of National Guard units, Army units, and they have saturated, especially the capital city of Culiacan, but it still has not stopped the violence that's taking place there. So I believe that this is going to continue until Mexico capture either the Chapitos or Maito Flaco so that, this stops the violence. And there's evidence that that violence is spreading into states like Sonora, Durango, and other states. So the Mexican government has got to address this very rapidly. They need to have a strategy, and they need to rely on intelligence, because I'm a firm believer that intelligence allows for better allocation of resources, and it provides a fulcrum from which to address the things that are taking place in the state of Sinaloa. And I might mention, Sherry, that the vast majority of the cartel leaders throughout the past several decades have all been in the state of Sinaloa. Talking about Chapo Guzman, Mayo Zambada, Juan Esparragosa Moreno, a.k.a. El Azul, the Arellano Felix brothers, they headed up the Tijuana cartel, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the so-called Lord of the Skies, that headed up the Juarez cartel. So it's a very interesting detail.
How safe is it? I know I've heard in the news that, some of these people will take machine guns or automatic rifles and go to these tourist agent areas. And it used to be that there was all this stuff going on in Mexico, but you could safely go to a tourist destination and be safe. But it doesn't seem that way anymore. What's going on with that? Or is it safe to travel in Mexico?
I would not recommend it. But you're absolutely right, Sherry. Here's the problem. It's not that the cartels are going to be necessarily targeting American citizens. A lot of times they do mistake them for rivals. Sometimes they do engage in kidnapping. But what happens is a lot of tourists make the mistake of going to tourist destinations like Cancun, Acapulco, Yucatan. They could be in a restaurant having lunch thinking that they're absolutely safe, and they don't know that a cartel hit team is coming in to execute a rival that might be in the restaurant where the tourists are at. Now, they're not going to go in there and check out the entire restaurant and see where this individual is at. They're going to come in and they're going to spray the entire restaurant. And that is with bullets. And that is how a lot of tourists, get killed. And a lot of times they feel secure in going to nice restaurants and what have you. But they don't understand that there could be a rival cartel member that is going to be executed during the time that you're there. And once those bullets start flying, bullets are very indiscriminate in nature.
Yeah, so you end up with collateral damage.
But here's the other thing, Sherry, is that it's very important that we here in the United States control assault weapons. Why? Because about 80 to 90% of the weapons that are in Mexico come from the United States. Now, Mexico has only one gun store, and that's on a military base near Mexico City. And it's the Army that sells these weapons. They're not assault weapons. They're, low caliber handguns or, for target practice, shotguns, things of that nature for hunting. And they only sell approximately 6,500 weapons a year. And that's very, very restrictive into who they sell to. Now we have what we called a river of iron, and these are the weapons that flow into Mexico. We estimate that there's about 200,000 weapons going into Mexico every year. And my question is, why are we arming the people that we're supposed to be fighting? So that is a big issue. Recently, you've heard Donald Trump talking about, attacking the cartels and what have you, but there's no mention of restricting the weapons flow from the United States southward. And it's not only to Mexico, but it's throughout Latin America and also the Caribbean. And then the other thing is that I don't hear anything about efforts. What are we going to do to reduce the demand here in the United States?
That is a problem. How would you, I know straw buying is illegal and they have some red flag things that they teach the stores to look for this and report it. How would you increase the awareness, maybe, I would say, of straw buying, where people are buying things and it's not necessarily for themselves, they're doing it for a third party?
I would, there's, public awareness is always a huge factor. And I appreciate the fact that you do it, Sherry, because people need to be aware of things that are happening. And if people are aware of it, they can help authorities combat certain problems, certain criminal activities, and at the same time take precautions as to not be a victim, as to, let's say, for example, even monitor their children in terms of, drug abuse and what have you. So one of the things that gun stores need to be aware of is individuals that go in there and buy several weapons, and they come in multiple times. We also need to create universal checks on the individuals that are buying these weapons. We need to address ghost guns where they assemble, bits and pieces of weapons, and they make ghost guns. We also need to address, the purchase of weapons at gun displays or gun
shows,
where they have these gun shows. And so there's a lot of things that can be done. And it's kind of interesting also that here in the United States, Sherry, we have more gun stores than we have McDonald's. And I think that's insane.
Yeah, I think it is too. And I went to a gun show. I heard so much about gun shows. I wanted to see what it was about. And I watched a guy go back several times buying parts of guns. And instead of buying it all at once and take it home and assemble it, he kept going back and buying this piece. Then he bought that piece. Then he bought another piece. And I'm like, there's no control over that. There was no, what's your name? Where do you live? There was no research. And the ghost gun thing, look at the guy, the CEO that got murdered by Luigi. He made a ghost gun.
Exactly. And then there's no controls also for private guns sales. For example, if Joe Blow wants to sell a gun, he can go on eBay, and then somebody else can contact Joe Blow and say, hey, I want the weapon. Send him the money. He mails out the gun. There's no controls. We need to do a better job of controlling weapons. Now, there are certain politicians that don't want to do that because they're in the pocket of the National Rifle Association that gives a lot of these politicians millions of dollars for their political campaigns. And it's not only the violence that's taking place in Mexico, but also here in the United States. We have more mass shootings, and a mass shooting is basically defined when 4 or more people are either killed or injured. And we have more mass shootings than we have days in the year. It's just absolutely shocking. And we still do not want to control guns. Is the problem here? Is money worth more than a human life?
Yeah, people have their priorities pretty screwed up. I've been saying that for a long time. I just don't feel, teenagers need to have be given a gun as a gift. Oh, my poor depressed child needs a weapon to cheer him up. That I've seen a couple of cases in the news where I was like scratching my head, like, what were you thinking as a parent? What are you thinking? I understand gun safety, teaching people gun safety, but that doesn't mean everybody that takes the class on gun safety needs to own a gun.
Absolutely right. And, you take a look at the massacre in Uvalde, and, the gun laws in Texas allow an 18-year-old to go in and buy a military-grade weapon like an AR-15.
Nobody needs that.
An 18-year-old, is, not entirely stable in terms of the usage of a weapon. So it's almost like, people, they hear about this issue of, and they use this politics of the Second Amendment, and they're going to take away your Second Amendment right. They're going to, and you have news channels that promote that insanity. They're going to take away your Second Amendment right, and then you have people that actually leave that nonsense and they get all riled up. But the fact of the matter is that the Second Amendment was passed at a time when people lived in isolated areas. There was no military, that you had to basically protect yourself. And we're talking about muskets that fired a single round. We're not talking about automatic weapons and machine guns that can fire dozens of rounds, and they're meant to inflict tremendous damage. So people just don't put things into context, and they are basically easily led by all this propaganda, especially the propaganda that they spew on Fox News.
Yeah. I wondered why the National Rifle Association, they started out as a 501c3, and as a 501c3, You can't be political and lobbying and doing things like that, yet they do. And I don't understand why they're allowed to do that when it's against the law.
Well, you're absolutely right. But, again, money talks. And a lot of these politicians, when you take a look at, all of these congressmen, I don't think that there's a single one who's not a millionaire.
Yeah,
Not a single one that is not a millionaire.
that's pretty sad. And we all know why they're millionaires.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you, there's a reward out on a few people. Nicolas Maduro, $25 million reward on him. Are there rewards on other people in Mexico? Or is it just, certain people, and how do they decide?
Well, this is decided by the U.S. Department of State, normally in coordination with the U.S. Department of Justice and agencies such as the DEA, FBI, Homeland Security. So there are a lot of rewards in many countries, to include Mexico, for example. Right now, there's a reward for Nemesio Ceguera Cervantes, a.k.a. El Mencho, who is the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. We're talking about a $15 million reward, and there's others. But also in Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, for the people that are not aware, Nicolás Maduro is the narco dictator of Venezuela. He replaced Hugo Chavez as a dictator when Hugo Chavez passed away from cancer. And in 2020, Nicolás Maduro and other high-ranking government officials in Venezuela were indicted here in the United States for narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, money laundering. And Nicolás Maduro recently, when he stole the recent elections on the day that he was assuming power again for another 6 years, he's been in power for 12 years, the $25 billion reward was announced. That is the maximum allowable reward for the U.S. Department of State. They statutorily, they can exceed $25 million. Keep in mind that was the amount for Osama bin Laden. But it was not only Nicolás Maduro, but also the Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello, has been part in. Both of them have been part of the so-called Cartel of the Suns, or the Cartel de los Soles. And they're called the Cartel of the Suns, Sherry, because here in the United States, generals wear stars. In Venezuela, the insignias are little suns, so they're called the Cartel of the Suns. And Hugo Chavez and also Nicolás Maduro were heavily linked to the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC as they're called. And they worked in collusion with the FARC and other criminal groups like the National Liberation Army, El Cartel Norte del Valle, and others that actually operate on Venezuelan soil. And it's estimated that Nicolás Maduro, the Cartel de los Soles, and the FARC, which signed a peace accord with the Colombian government in 2016, but there's still dissidents operating. But all these criminal groups were moving approximately 250 metric tons of cocaine through Venezuela, into Central America, into Mexico, and then into the United States. Nicolás Maduro has basically destroyed the political system, the judiciary, and then even worse, the economy, because Venezuela, it sits on the biggest oil or the petroleum reserves in the world, more so than Saudi Arabia. And when the price of a barrel of oil was at about $100, the economy was booming. But when the price of of oil dropped from $100 to $50 a barrel, the economy just was completely destroyed.
Okay.
Right now, we have one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the history of the world, where 7.7 million people have fled Venezuela because they have no running water. They have no medicine. They have no food. They're under threat of violence. So many of them have fled into neighboring Colombia, into Brazil. Others have gone into Peru, Bolivia, Chile.
Argentina.
They've also gone into Central America, Mexico. Some of them have fled here into the United States, and I can't blame them because they stay in Venezuela and probably die because of illness or die of starvation. So it's caused a huge problem. And during the last election, Maduro stole the election from an oppositional candidate by the name of Edmundo Gonzalez. And there was fraud. Now that they had the inauguration again, the only leaders that went were Daniel Ortega out of Nicaragua, and then also Miguel Diaz-Canel, who is now the dictator of Cuba. Maduro has been shunned. The U.S. is putting more economic sanctions. The U.K. is putting more sanctions. Canada is putting sanctions. But Maduro is enriching himself through the drug trade.
So when you say narco-terrorism, that is the drug trade coming from his location, making its way up to us.
Well, narco-terrorism has involved a lot of cartels, like, for example, the term narco-terrorism was originally coined when Pablo Escobar was the leader of the Medellin cartel before he was killed in 1993 on a rooftop in downtown Medellin. But narco-terrorism, Sherry, refers to the attempts of narcotics traffickers to influence the policies of a government or society through violence and intimidation. That's the meaning of narco-terrorism.
I've heard it before, and I'm like, okay, I've never seen a definition, so I just wanted to be sure and the listeners understand what's going on. Now, you were talking about Honduras is going to end extradition treaty with the U.S. What's involved with that?
Well, Honduras had an extradition treaty with the United States beginning 1909. And then when they, developed a new constitution in 1986, they did not allow for the extradition of its citizens to the United States, and it basically did away with the extradition treaty with the U.S. However, in 2012, under Porfirio Lobo, who was the president at that time, there was a meeting in Miami with U.S. officials, and Lobo agreed to re-implement the extradition treaty. Now, when the former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was extradited to the United States on drug trafficking charges, he's been sentenced to approximately 45 years in prison. There were names that surfaced during the trial, and those names involved the family of the current president of Honduras, Xiomara Castro. Her husband is Mel Zelaya, who was a former president of Honduras that was ousted in a coup d'etat in 2009 because he wanted to change the constitution for his betterment, and it was opposed by the Supreme Court of Honduras. They removed him from power, put him on a plane, flew him to Costa Rica, and dropped him off at the airstrip But now he's back. His wife is the president, and it's actually him that is running the government, not his wife. So when these names started to surface involving the Zelaya family, they started to look for a pretext to do away with the extradition treaty. And they found it when the head of the military, Roosevelt Hernandez, and then the former Minister of Defense went to Venezuela to meet with the Secretary of Defense under Maduro. His name is Vladimir Padrino Lopez, who is also accused of drug trafficking here in the United States. He's been indicted. And the U.S. ambassador to Honduras by the name of Laura Dogu commented. And all she said, I'm surprised to see the Honduran officials sitting down with an accused drug trafficker in Venezuela. She expressed her concern. And all of a sudden, the government started to say that this was imperialism, that interference by the U.S. government. They even stated that the U.S. government was planning another coup in Venezuela. And then you had the foreign minister, Enrique Reina, commenting on the fact that the extradition treaty could be used as a political weapon, which is nonsense. And the reason that they wanted to do that again is because, I'll give you a case in point, is Mel Zelaya's brother, Carlos Zelaya, was videotaped having a meeting with drug traffickers in Honduras. I'm talking about this major drug trafficking group, Los Cachiros, and then also Juan Mata, Guadaraga. And they were videotaped, and they're talking about providing bribes to Mel Zelaya's brother. And the brother is saying that he's going to distribute some of that bribe money, and then that half of it is going to go to the comandante, Ismael Zelaya. That's the name that they've given him, the comandante. So that is the main reason that they're wanting to do away with the extradition treaty, is to protect the family of Xiomara Castro from being extradited. And Mel Zelaya was, during an interview a few years ago, stated that Honduras would never do away with the extradition treaty, but he didn't have a problem with it until it affected him and his family. And now Xiomara Castro is talking about this U.S. military base in Palmerola. It's at an airfield, which provides a lot of aid to Honduras. During natural disasters, they provide medicine, but they also aid a lot in the combat of the illegal drug trade. So Xiomara Castro is saying that if Donald Trump starts to deport or mistreat Honduran citizens, that she's going to kick the U.S. military out of the military base of Palmerola. So it seems like they're taking these unusual steps to eliminate what would be tremendous tools in combating drug trafficking in Honduras. When Juan Orlando Hernandez, the convicted drug trafficker here in the United States, when he was in power, he turned Honduras into a narco state. We estimate that most of the drugs emanating from Colombia and through Venezuela, going through Central America, most of it was going through Honduras because of its strategic site. So at that time, it was a transit country. But since then, Sherry, has become a country where they produce cocaine. They're starting to discover large plantations of coca bushes, And then, also cocaine conversion labs in Honduras. And it's a little bit shocking because Xiomara Castro, not that long ago, attended a United Nations meeting, and she talked about supporting the dictatorships in Nicaragua, with Daniel Ortega in Cuba, and then also Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. Never mentioned her country, which is suffering tremendously again from lack of education, lack of health care, lack of food, and, extreme poverty. So I think that the government is really leaning to becoming a socialist country, if it's not already.
And it seems like some of these areas, they change governments every 30 days and their whole philosophy changes, and you just get used to one thing happening and something else is put into place.
The thing is that in a lot of these countries, Sherry, corruption has become normalized. And in Honduras, you have three primary political parties, and there's corruption. Corruption abounds in all three of them. And, who pays the price? The citizens of Honduras, who are, very decent people, hardworking people, but, they suffer from extreme poverty. And we all know that, drugs go hand in hand with violence.
Yes. So let me ask you this, is if they do this, they end the extradition treaty. If somebody is in the United States and they commit a crime, is that going to affect deporting them back to their own country?
Well, the thing is that the United States can always deport foreign nationals, so that would not impact, but it's going to impact on the ability of the U.S. to try a lot of these major drug traffickers that operate in Honduras. And, the extradition treaty will only, aid the drug traffickers because it will allow them to operate with greater impunity.
I was under the impression that in order to deport somebody, the country that you're deporting them to had to be willing to take them.
No, you have to, they don't have to be willing to take them. You can still deport them.
Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the border. I think everybody I've talked to has a different definition of what an open border means. I know that legally, what is the definition of an open border?
Well, an open border means that there's absolutely no restrictions. We've heard that Jim Jordan, the Republican from U.S. House of Representatives, talk about, open borders, making accusations that the southern border is an open border. And then also in the two presidential debates where Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, and then Mike Pence alluded to an open border, that is not true. Obviously, they never offered any evidence as to that, because prior to 1920, there was an open border where people from both sides of the border, U.S. and Mexico, could cross freely into each other's country. But then in 1920, that started to change with the advent of the Ku Klux Klan. And all of a sudden, there was anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish sentiment. So they started to put more restrictions on the border. It has become pretty much heavily fortified. It's not perfect. But in 1992, the Border Patrol went from less than 5,000 to more than 20,000, a quadruple. Apart from that, there's barriers on the border, and the Border Patrol, now has outposts, and they have a lot of high technology to assist them. I'm talking about drones. I'm talking about unattended ground sensors with camera systems. And then on the legal ports of entry, many years ago, the customs was only able to search about 17% of cargo vehicles and about 3% of passenger vehicles. Now they're starting to put X-ray scanners. They've done that, and hopefully by next year they anticipate being able to scan 75% of the cargo trucks and over 25% of passenger vehicles. So it's becoming heavily fortified. And apart from that, if it was an open border, you would not have the Border Patrol making, record number of arrests at the border. There would be literally no arrests. And that absolutely should, make sense to most people. But it's not an open border. The lines at these custom stations have become longer, because we do have a lot of people that are coming in and seeking asylum. So now, the U.S. is looking at extending the hours, like at the port of entry here in New Mexico, Santa Teresa. So it's not an open border by any standard. But unfortunately, a lot of politicians, especially the Republicans, make fodder and political theater of this.
I think when the news, I know here in Tucson, the news was showing a lot of open places at the border where people were coming through illegally. And what they, I think, failed to address were these people that set up tables. They set up their tents with water and snacks and stuff. And they had some organization, I don't know if it was the Red Cross, so don't quote me, would hand them maps on, where to go and how to get there. And my thought was, okay, I understand giving them water. They're probably thirsty, but tell them go back on the other side of the border and come through the front door. This is illegal entry, what you're doing here. And all these people are doing is enabling them. What would you say to these people?
Well, I think that they're taking this out of context. And the reality is that it is the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross, started giving these safety pamphlets to the migrants that were crossing through Central America. And I reiterate, safety pamphlets. And this started in probably earlier than 2018. And it was only to tell these migrants that were coming with children, with elderly people, where they could get medical attention, where they could get shelter, where they could get food. They were not assisting them in terms of circumventing, the security measures along the border. It was only to help them survive that journey. I heard a sheriff in Arizona saying that the Red Cross should tell them not to come. But that's a very simplistic statement because he doesn't know that these people are coming to the United States because of natural disasters in their country. Again, because of dictatorships like in Venezuela, where they have no medicine, no food, no water. So they are leaving those countries and they're under threat. They're under threat, again, because of U.S. weapons, again, because of the fact that they are suffering from, homicides and kidnappings and extortion. Most of them don't want to leave their countries. They don't want to leave their countries, but they feel that they have no choice. And who would risk that journey and potentially falling into the hands of the cartels that are going to extort them, put them into the labor trade, and then the girls and women into the sex trade? So to say that, to tell them not to come, that shows me that this person really doesn't have any clue of the situation. But those pamphlets are only to ensure the safety. They're not promoting, illegal migration into the United States. They're doing their job and trying to save humans, the reality of those pamphlets. They're not to tell them where they can go and hide and anything like that. It's just to provide safety. But nobody says anything about the videos that I've seen where I've seen officials on the U.S. side of the border where people have left these gallon plastic jugs of water for the migrants to drink. You know, if they're out in the desert, these officials are kicking the water. And to me, you know, how inhumane can you potentially be?
I know the Border Patrol has water stations throughout different areas. So, you know, I think they're trying to help people.
But there's some individuals that, and I've seen the videos of them kicking these water jugs, you know, why would you do that? I mean, how careless can you be? For example, here in New Mexico, you know, we got a very good district attorney for Bernalillo County, Sam Bregman, who's the chair of the organized New Mexico Organized Crime Commission, did a joint operation with officials from the state of Chihuahua to address migrant smuggling. And they were able to rescue a lot of migrants that were being smuggled. They arrested human traffickers, but they also saved the life of a woman who was on the verge of dying in the desert. She was, you know, completely dehydrated. And so those are the things that should be done, you know, not villainizing or, you know, making villains out of migrants, saying they're criminals, rapists, and thieves. These are hardworking people that come here and they contribute heavily to the economy of the United States. They do jobs nobody else wants to do. Wants to go pick crops for maybe less than $5 an hour, which is backbreaking. And these migrants also contribute or pay approximately $400 billion a year in taxes, and they don't receive any benefit from those taxes. So the mass deportation that they're planning is going to have a serious impact on the economy, and these people that were concerned about paying $1 for an orange may have to pay $10 for an orange.
It's definitely a topic of controversy all across the country, and I'm not sure the northern border has the same conversation as we do down here on the southern border. But they don't?
They don't. Recently, there's been some mention, but they've never mentioned the northern border. And the fact of the matter is that there's drugs that come through the northern border with Canada.
Yeah.
You know, and apart from that, you know, between 20 and 2024, you know, U.S. authorities stopped, you know, many individuals. I think it was like 550 individuals that were on terrorist watch lists. Now, if terrorists are going to come into the country, they're probably going to come in through into the country from the northern border, but not from the southern border. But they don't preoccupy themselves a lot with the northern border because Canada is primarily white.
That sounds like a racist thing. I'm sorry.
It is. It
absolutely.
It is a racist thing, and this mass deportation is a racist thing. But that is what we have coming into the picture.
Okay, we're almost out of time, and I want the listeners to know that you are an amazing author. I know you're working on your 9th book, but you have 8 of them, and some of them are on the shelf behind you. Tell people about the premise for what you write a book. I'm pretty sure that some of these are on experiences you've had in your job, because we didn't even talk about the fact that you're retired DEA. You spent a lot of time internationally.
That's correct. I was with the Drug Enforcement Administration for 31 years. I was the special agent in charge of the Caribbean and San Diego divisions, and then also chief of international operations. I worked abroad, if you consider the Caribbean, for about 18 years, 13 and a half years in Mexico, about 4 years in Colombia, South America. And then as chief of international operations, I developed many multinational operations, and then also, intelligence sharing platforms with many countries around the world. My books are, the first one, Deal, which is a play on DEAL, is really my memoir. And then the others are novels involving drug trafficking, but based on my experiences. And I'm about to finish my 9th book. I should have finished it about 6 months ago, but I give interviews internationally every single day. So I haven't been able to get to it, but hopefully by next month I should have it finished. And then I'll have to have some of my friends edit it, and then I'll have it published. And it deals with, the title is Ursula, Child Soldier, and it involves a young girl that was abducted by the National Liberation Army of Colombia and incorporated into their ranks, and then eventually rises to head the entire subversive organization. Very interesting. But again, based on my experiences with subversive groups, terrorism, and drug trafficking.
So if people go to Amazon, can they find your books on Amazon?
Yes, just go onto the internet and then just put Mike Vigil, DEA books, and they should find them all there.
Yeah, I know you've got quite a few, and I've read a couple of them, and they're very interesting because you know that it's based on your experiences, and it's like, wow, I can't believe you lived through this.
Well, my friends asked me, well, how did you survive? And I said, well, through time, especially when you're working a lot of undercover, which I did in Mexico and, basically all over Latin America, you develop a sixth sense. And it kept me alive because, I could sense danger, but I always had plans. I always had exit plans. I always, was very strategic in nature.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show today. I appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us and your perspective of what's going on in the world. And before we leave, I want to ask our listeners to check out the lawmatters1030.org website. You'll find our web store there, all our podcasts, and please help support our C3 mission by joining our 1030 challenge. I also want to thank our guests for chatting with us today and all our listeners for tuning in, because law matters.